Generally speaking, games are collaborative efforts. It may seem like an obvious thing to say, but I feel it's important to remember because of how often we lay all the blame or all the praise on a single person. In a lot of cases, it makes sense. How can you discuss Metal Gear Solid without Kojima, or Ico without Fumito Ueda? These kinds of developers clearly like to leave their marks on their games, and as a result, a lot of the time it can feel like they are the only ones behind their successes. But what about games like Final Fantasy VI, which has 2 directors and a very involved producer? Who should take responsibility for it? Is this product inherently less cohesive because it has so many creative leaderships? Is it less worthy of an analysis of its ideas because of that? Well, obviously I don't think so, but what I really want to do here is to propose that, given everything that this game tries to say with its themes, being made by so many different visions is exactly what made it work. To prove my point, I'll be looking into 3 aspects of Final Fantasy VI design, to try and piece together not only what the game is saying, but how it is trying to do so. This will be a spoiler-heavy analysis and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. To say music has always been a huge part of this franchise is an understatement. Admittedly, even if I'm not as fond of the other games as I am of Final Fantasy VI, it is hard to deny that music is usually amongst the greatest qualities of each release. With that said, I feel the 6th installment takes music in this series to a whole new level. And what I mean by that isn't so much about my personal taste. It is about how this game used music to overcome limitations of the text and graphics and tell a more compelling story in the process. How it does that is through the extensive use of leitmotifs, which, to put it simply, consists mainly of attributing melodies or riffs to specific plot points or individual characters. One of the most prominent examples throughout the game would probably be Terra's theme. When she is deciding whether to join the Returners, it is rearranged into the song Awakening. Her theme is also barely recognizable in the background of the song Metamorphosis. This is nothing new to video games, or even Final Fantasy for that matter, but it is usually relegated to 2 or 3 characters at most, or an important plot point or object. Final Fantasy VI, on the other hand, has a theme for every single one of its 14 playable characters, and some of them have at least one rearranged version to fit a different moment of that character's arc. For example, the song Forever Rachel, which is played during moments relating to the tragic relationship between Rachel and Locke, and so it sports the same basic melody from his theme, but with a more subdued, quieter arrangement. Also, it is being played in G minor as opposed to G major like the original piece. Have a listen. The same general idea is also present in the following examples. By now it's pretty clear that music sits at the core of this game, so I think it is crucial to talk about the two biggest musical set pieces in it, and how they relate to the use of leitmotifs. The first one is the opera scene. This iconic moment serves as one of the few breaks from the main plot in the game, but that's not to say that it doesn't carry a tremendous amount of important information. This narrative within the narrative is a clear reflection of the operatic motifs spread throughout the work, like the title cards from the characters similar to a playbill, or the credits in the ending similar to an opera program, as well as the clearly defined 3-act structure. Most important, however, is its fake ending. In simple terms, in a play of this kind, the outcome dictates whether it fits into the tragedy or comedy category, depending on who gets the girl at the end. But when the time comes for the ending, it is interrupted by Locke and Ultros, much like how the floating continent seems to be leading into a final confrontation, only for Kefka to turn the story in a different direction. The most pertinent aspect of this scene to our discussion, however, is the moment Sella sings Aria di mezzo carattere. It is a moment of self-discovery for her, and one of the ways we can interpret that is because the song is nothing more than a half-step-down version of her own theme, with added lyrics about lovers separated by war, which mirrors her relationship with Locke. The level of expression the sprites of Final Fantasy VI could show was already far above that of its predecessors, but perhaps the impact of these scenes wouldn't have stood the test of time as well as they have if it weren't accompanied by powerful and cleverly implemented music. The other musical set piece I would like to highlight is the ending. The massive songs Dancing Mad and Balance Restored, which are used for the final boss and final cutscene respectively. Dancing Mad is a little bit more complex, so let's start with Balance Restored, which brings the use of leitmotif up front and shows us the characters while their songs mix from one into the next as their arcs are resolved, further emphasizing the bonds they've created. I would say the most brilliant moment of this piece happens when Sella's theme starts playing and then seamlessly transitions into Locke's theme to indicate their romantic bond. It is in these moments that we can see the full effect of leitmotifs as a storytelling device, because instead of a pixelated kissing scene like we got in Final Fantasy IV, the culmination of their romance is represented through the music. The end result is a sequence that aged far better than it would have otherwise. After each character is accounted for, the song moves on to a hectic rendition of Setzer's theme as the Falcon follows Terra through the debris. After they escape, it culminates in the regular triumphant version of the song, as the ship soars through the skies and the credits start rolling. It's just another example of the way the game has been telling its story throughout, and it's put to good use here. Moving backwards to Dancing Mad, it is impressive that it manages to extend the musical references farther than any other song in the game by moving away from its boundaries and making use of real-world music, more specifically fragments of Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, played in a synthesized church organ which, when coupled with visual reference to the Divine Comedy in the enemy design and a twisted version of Pietà at the top, are meant to symbolize Kefka's ascension to godhood. Have a listen. The final fourth of the song starts with the same music the game does, bringing everything full circle before the final confrontation, where we can hear what seems to be a mixing from the melody from Kefka's theme and the melody from the song for the Ultima weapon, further driving the point that he has now attained some sort of ancient power. The slow portion of this song also deserves special mention because of how much depth it adds to the character without saying a single word. Many have interpreted this to mean that Kefka is afraid of his approaching death, while others believe that he is accepting of his imminent fate. Some even say that this part is a reflection of the moment of pause he had when the heroes showed him life was still worth living even in this dying world. Such a massive and complex song for a single character is a clear demonstration that Kefka is an exceptionally important one, which I know is a bit of a given since he is the main villain after all, but the reason he's so crucial to the plot and why he's such a great villain is because his story and what he represents is the antithesis of everything Final Fantasy VI stands for. Final Fantasy has never been a series where identifying what the games are about was a problem. Despite being criticized for convoluted plots, the game's central themes are usually pretty clear to those paying attention. And in truth, Final Fantasy VI is no exception. Occasionally, I would even say the writing is a bit on the nose about things, but that's not to say that it can't be subtle in unexpected ways. Over the years, there has been some debate over who the true protagonist of the game is. Some claim it is Terra because we start the game with her and of how she represents the power of union between humans and espers. Others point to Celes because of her arc in the world of ruin, which involves the desperation of loneliness, but also the hope brought by reuniting with her friends. I've also seen arguments for Locke and Kefka even. Personally, I feel like the most appropriate answer to this question is that none of the characters are the main character. At its core, Final Fantasy VI is a game about human bonds and unity, and none of the characters could have achieved by themselves what they did together. It is not a story about chosen heroes or mystical prophecies, it is about a group of people under extreme circumstances that find support and strength in one another. Their individual problems shape who they are and make them integral parts that add up to something greater than their sum. This is why all of them have an arc that deals with their personal issues, even if they are unrelated to the main plot, like finding Gao's father or Cyan's love letters. These things flesh them out and make each one feel like an important piece of the whole. Terra is literally the physical manifestation of the union between conflicting cultures, and is more powerful precisely because of that. Even though she was raised to be a weapon, she's actually not very keen on being defined by her abilities. The game actually does something really clever with this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the world of ruin, she finds herself as a foster mother for children orphaned in the catastrophe, and loses her will to fight. It is only when she sees that fighting is the only way to save her friends and her children that she snaps out of it and rejoins the group to guarantee a future for the people she loves. Here we can see a secondary theme that comes into play in the individual character stories, the theme of love. This sub-theme is accounted for in almost every character arc in one form or another, but my favorite instance has to be Celes. Celes is a lot like Terra in the sense that she was raised by the Empire to be a soldier and nothing else. In the world of balance, she slowly warms up to the group after betraying the Empire, but when the world is destroyed and she's left stranded on an island, she goes back to having only one person she can rely on, Sid, the engineer who was the closest thing she had to her father growing up. Sid eventually succumbs to the world of ruin, and when Celes is faced with a reality in which all of the people she's grown to love are gone, she attempts to commit suicide. When she later discovers Locke's bandana on a wounded bird, it reignites her resolve and renews her hopes of seeing her friends again. This is what gives her the strength to reassemble the party and take the fight to Kefka. Honestly, even Mog, which is usually put alongside Gogo and Umaro as a character with no character, actually does have an interesting tidbit a lot of people miss. In the world of Ruin, the player can find Mog in the Narsh caves where the Mughals used to live. If you choose to talk to him, he'll be extremely happy to see living people and will rejoin your party. This is where his individual story ends for most players, but if you examine the place where he was standing, you can find the Mughal charm, or Molulu's charm if you've been playing the proper translation, which was probably given to him by another Mughal the player has already met in the beginning of the game. Considering the cave is empty and the fact that Mog is facing the wall, it could be interpreted that he had some degree of friendship with Molulu and was possibly mourning this Mughal's death. It is subtle in a way you wouldn't expect for a series known for being melodramatic. The level of importance given to the characters easily outweighs the importance given to plot devices, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the final third of the game. The final stretch of the typical JRPG is usually filled with plot twists or quests for the ultimate weapon that can slay the villain. But in Final Fantasy VI, the action-packed third act is replaced by intimate stories about all of the characters, and it works because the game is, in reality, all about them. The War of the Magi, the Gestahl Empire, the Esper world, all of these things are good for world building and lore, but ultimately, the reason we care is because of the party, so it was an extremely smart choice to focus the final act on their stories. There is no secret MacGuffin and there is no big revelation. All that is needed to defeat Kefka is to unite their strengths. Yes, it is the old Japanese cliche of using the power of friendship to kill a god, but here I would argue it is done tastefully, because the whole game is centered on that theme. Of course friendship would be all that's needed to beat Kefka, because that's the one thing he never had. The way he deals with his nihilistic view of the world meant that, to him, these bonds were futile. Why do people cling to life knowing that they must someday die, knowing that none of it will have meant anything once they do? Is a quote that clearly shows that. He uses this to justify horrible actions. After all, if nothing matters, why should we get hung up on things like justice and morals? Kefka does what he wants because everything that could ground him are just arbitrary rules made by insignificant people. In a sense, Kefka could be considered a misrepresented, radicalized version of Nietzsche's Übermensch, which is basically a person who makes its own values in spite of what society may think. This is a very shallow reading of what Nietzsche really meant, but this is why I refer to it as being misrepresented. If you indulge me for a second and accept that reading, I would say it's pretty safe to qualify the party members as absurd heroes, which is a term created by Albert Camus to designate those who could accept the meaninglessness of life and still choose to be happy. Even after the group is faced with the destruction of their world and their new god is the one to blame, they still say life is worth living in the ending, even while everything is crumbling around them. It's interesting that Celes overcomes suicidal tendencies while Strago joins and subsequently leaves a religious cult, because according to Camus, physical and philosophical suicide are the two ways in which people can try to negate the absurd. For further proof of this philosophy being a key theme of this game, just look at what Terra says in response to the Kefka quote I just read. It's not the end that matters, it's knowing that you have something to live for right now, at this moment. Final Fantasy VI shows its characters and their relationships triumphing over Kefka's extreme individualism because he wants you to believe in the power that comes with the bonds they've created. But what's really special about it is that this is not just conveyed through aesthetics and story, but through gameplay as well. One of the challenges of combining gameplay and story in a game like this is making the player care for the individuals both as a character and as a resource. Comparing the original Final Fantasy to Final Fantasy IV, we can see both extremes. In the original, characters didn't have a personality. They were merely tools to be used in combat, and as such, the player only cares for them as a resource. Meanwhile, a party member like Edward from Final Fantasy IV may be pretty useless, but you wouldn't be surprised if a lot of fans really enjoyed his character. Some are bound to be better fighters than others despite how cool their personalities are. Final Fantasy VI already sports pretty likable characters thanks to fairly good, if a bit archetypal writing, but to make sure that they were also valuable in gameplay, the developers implemented a considerable amount of player customization. Between relics and espers, the player can shape most characters into viable options for combat. The possible thematic problem that could arise from this is making characters too interchangeable, like in Final Fantasy I. If that happened, the individual quirks that make each one of them unique pieces of a greater whole would still be present in the plot, but not the gameplay. Thankfully, the game avoids that by giving each character a unique ability related to their class. So now we have a system where instead of choosing jobs and classes like in Final Fantasy 1, 3, and 5, the player chooses between these people that personify the classes, all the while still being allowed the freedom to shape their stats and buffs in interesting ways. These abilities may seem unimportant, since some are way less useful than simply maximizing stats, but I would argue that the psychological effect they have is very significant, especially on first-time players. Early stats and character-specific weapons are also a bit of a differentiator, but if you want to perform a blitz or steal some items, you're gonna need the right character for the job. These actions are inherently tied to them, and therefore are a lot more memorable in the mind of a player than which characters have high defense or high attack numbers. Because the characters are mostly defined by their abilities, the game can create a really interesting dynamic with Terra. At first, her ability to use magic is her defining trait in gameplay, and it is also the reason both the Empire and the Returners are interested in her. At this point, she has amnesia and doesn't remember who she really is. That is until the Battle of Narj, where she reacts to the frozen Esper and transforms into an out-of-control beast. It's close to this point in the game that magic becomes available to all party members, so Terra's defining ability is turned into something unremarkable at the exact time where her true identity and origins are being questioned the most. The question of who she is represented both in gameplay and story. When she awakens and is given the memories of her father, she rejoins the party with a new morph ability. So as we get the answer to her origins, we also unlock her true potential as a party member. The entirety of this arc is portrayed through the gameplay, using the rules the game has set. The gameplay identity of every character is defined by their ability. In a sense, this system sports the best of both worlds. A player who is more invested in the combat can still choose his party based on which ones have better stats and abilities, while those more invested in the plot can make viable parties using their favorite characters from the story simply by learning to use espers and relics effectively. All that being said, it's clear that Final Fantasy VI doesn't want you to keep a party of favorites and forget about the rest. On multiple points in the game, it asks the player to take control of multiple parties, effectively forcing them to use characters they wouldn't otherwise and get to know them better. The fights where the player must control 3 different parties exemplify how the theme of Final Fantasy VI permeates the gameplay as much as the story. Here we have conflicts that literally could not have been won without combined forces. Before the Battle of Narj, the game has set up the idea that these characters still don't fully trust one another, but their loyalties are never brought up again afterwards, with one exception being Celis, and only for a fleeting moment. I believe that the battle itself was all the proof that the characters needed to gain each other's trust, and what's beautiful about it is the fact that the players themselves were the ones coordinating multiple parties in unison during this event. Even in the earlier segment, when playing as mostly inconsequential Mughals, the game is demonstrating the power of uniting against greater threats. The game is so in line with the themes and ideas presented that even a staple of RPGs like swapping party members has a greater significance and enhances the game's themes when you consider that this is the first Final Fantasy to include such a mechanic. though it could just be a coincidence. This is an argument that I imagine a lot of detractors of this sort of reading of the game will present, that this is reading too much into things, and that a lot of these mechanics are simply staples of the genre. In truth, all of the things I've talked about could still be just coincidences. It is possible that the gameplay changes I'm referring to were made without as much thought put into it. Regardless, the end result is the same. Final Fantasy VI remains interesting after 23 years because it is a game with a clear message that doesn't sacrifice gameplay to make its point. Instead, I would argue it uses it in favor of its themes and plot, making for an unforgettable experience. What I'm talking about when I praise the way Final Fantasy VI integrated its story and gameplay is not really a prerequisite for an enjoyable game for me, but it is something that can elevate a good game to a great one, and I feel that's exactly what happened here. By not placing the player in the shoes of any individual character, the game allows us to feel the struggle of all of them and see how their bonds make them stronger. I would like to read a quote from Yoshinori Kitase about the development of the game. "We began work on Final Fantasy VI with the idea that every character is the protagonist of the story. Everyone on the team contributed ideas for characters into a melting pot. We were very keen to design a game featuring individual episodes for each character. I find it amazing how this theme of cooperation permeates even the creative process of the game. The impression I get is that from its very inception, this was a game about collaboration being built through collaboration, and the final product shows a level of commitment and talent that isn't often seen in other works. From the absolutely massive jumping quality in terms of visuals, which allowed for more expressive characters, to the stunning soundtrack composed with each story beat in mind. From the highly customizable and varied gameplay to the carefully constructed plot scenarios. Everyone on the team seems to have been working very closely with one another, and the end result is a game that feels incredibly cohesive in its vision, despite having so many different minds working on it at the same time.